the Gilded Age. It was a time when the map of the world was filling up. Livingstone had walked across Africa. The source of the Nile had been found. The American West was being tamed by railroads. But there was one blank space left, one great white spot at the top of the world, the North Pole. It was the Holy Grail, the Everest of the 19th century. Men threw themselves at it, and the ice threw them back. But in 1879, science believed it had solved the puzzle. The leading geographers of the day, men with beards and globes in London and Berlin, believed something that sounds insane to us today. They believed in the open polar sea. They thought that the ice was just a ring, a barrier, and if you could punch through that ring, you would find a warm tropical ocean at the top of the world. They believed that the warm currents from Japan flowed north and melted the ice cap from below. They imagined a paradise where whales played and ancient civilizations might still exist. It was a beautiful lie, and men would die for it. This is the story of the expedition that tested that lie. It is the story of 33 men who sailed into a frozen trap. It is the story of the USS Jeannette. The story begins not on a ship, but in a mansion in New York City, with a man named James Gordon Bennett Jr. He was the owner of the New York Herald. He was the richest, wildest, most eccentric bachelor in America. He was the Elon Musk of his day, but with more scandal. He once arrived at a high society party and urinated in the fireplace. He raced yachts. He drove coaches naked at midnight. But mostly, he bought news. He didn't just report history, he created it. He was the man who sent Henry Stanley to Africa to find Dr. Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? That was Bennett's money talking. That story sold millions of papers. Now, Bennett needed a sequel. He looked at his globe. He saw the Arctic. "We will solve the mystery of the North," Bennett declared. "We will plant the American flag on the pole." He didn't care about science. He cared about headlines. He needed a ship, and more importantly, he needed a hero to captain it. Enter George Washington DeLong. He was everything Bennett was not. DeLong was a career Navy officer, serious, religious, intense. He had a square jaw, piercing eyes, and a mustache that looked like it was carved from granite. He was a man of duty. He had tasted the Arctic once before on a rescue mission, and the Arctic fever had never left his blood. He wanted glory, but not for money. He wanted glory for the Navy and for his wife, Emma. Emma DeLong is the heart of this story. She was not the weeping woman left on the dock. She was his partner. She helped him plan. She helped him lobby Congress. But she had a terrible premonition. She looked at the maps, at the jagged white lines, and she felt a cold hand on her heart. "You will come back," she told him, "but you will be changed." DeLong ignored the fear. He focused on the mission. Bennett bought a ship, the Pandora, a British gunboat. They renamed her the Jeannette after Bennett's sister. She was sturdy, but she wasn't an icebreaker. She was a coal-powered steamer with sails, a hybrid. They reinforced the hull with extra timber. They covered the bow in iron. They filled the hold with 3 years of food: canned beef, pemmican, lime juice, chocolate, and Edison's new electric lights. They were bringing the cutting edge of 1879 technology to the Stone Age of the North. The plan was specific. Most explorers tried to reach the pole from the Atlantic side via Greenland. DeLong was going the other way, through the Bering Strait, between Alaska and Russia. Why? Because of the Kuroshio Current, the Black Stream of Japan. The scientists told DeLong that this warm current flowed right through the Bering Strait, cutting a highway of warm water through the ice. "Ride the current," they said. "It will take you straight to the open polar sea." It was a perfect theory, except for one thing. The current didn't go north. It turned east, into the Pacific. There was no warm highway. There was only the pack. But DeLong didn't know that. He stood on the deck of the Jeannette in San Francisco Harbor, looking at the Golden Gate. He felt destiny calling. DeLong handpicked his men. He didn't want just sailors. He wanted scientists and mechanics. George Melville, the chief engineer, a giant of a man, huge beard, loud voice, indestructible. Melville was the guy you wanted in a foxhole. He could fix a steam engine with a wrench and a curse. Lieutenant Charles Chipp, the executive officer, quiet, competent, the calm in the storm. Jerome Collins, the meteorologist. He was an employee of Bennett's newspaper, a civilian. He was Irish, talkative, witty. DeLong hated him. DeLong was Navy discipline. Collins was press freedom. From day one, there was friction. DeLong saw Collins as a spy for Bennett, a man who was there to write gossip, not read barometers. And then there was the crew, a mix of nationalities, Scandinavians, Germans, Americans, and two Inuit hunters from Alaska, Alexei and Onegin. They were the only ones who knew how to survive in the cold. They looked at the piles of canned food and shook their heads. White men eat strange things, they thought. July 8, 1879, San Francisco. It was the party of the decade. The Jeannette was docked at Mare Island. Yachts surrounded her. Cannons fired salutes. Crowds lined the hills of San Francisco to watch her leave. Emma DeLong stood on the deck for the final goodbye. She held her husband's hands. They didn't say much. The noise of the crowd was too loud. She gave him a silk flag to fly at the pole. He kissed her. "I will bring it back," he promised. She walked down the gangplank. The steam whistle blew, a mournful, deep sound that echoed off the Golden Gate Bridge, which wasn't built yet, but off the headlands. The Jeannette chugged out to sea, black smoke pouring from her stack, sails unfurling. To the people on shore, she looked magnificent. To the ocean, she looked like a toy. They turned north, toward the Bering Sea, toward the silence. They stopped in Alaska to pick up sled dogs and furs. St. Michael's Outpost. This was the last contact with the outside world. DeLong sat in his cabin and wrote his final letter to Emma. It is a heartbreaking document. It is full of confidence, but underneath, there is the ache of separation. "I have a good ship and a good crew," he wrote. "We are entering the list to fight for the prize. If we succeed, my name will be made. If we fail, I will have tried my best." He sealed the envelope. He handed it to the mailboat heading south. He watched the mailboat disappear. Now, the umbilical cord was cut. There was no radio in 1879, no GPS. If they got into trouble, nobody would know. They were sailing off the edge of the map. September 1879. They passed through the Bering Strait. To the left, Siberia. To the right, Alaska. Ahead, the Arctic Ocean. The water was gray and choppy. The temperature dropped. DeLong stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon with his telescope. He was looking for the ice, and he was looking for the warm current. He put his hand in the water bucket drawn from the sea. It was cold, freezing. Where was the Japanese warmth? "It must be further north," he told Melville. "We just have to push through." Then they saw it. A white line on the horizon, glittering, jagged. The ice pack. It wasn't slush. It was solid polar ice, 10 feet thick. DeLong ordered the ship forward. "We will ram it," he said. "We will find a lead." The Jeannette hit the ice. Crunch. She shuddered. She broke through the first layer. They cheered. "We are through." But behind the first layer was another, and another. The open polar sea was a mirage. The ice wasn't a ring. It was a continent. And on September 5th, the trap snapped shut. The ice closed in around the rudder. It gripped the hull. The ship stopped moving. The steam engine strained. The propeller churned. But the Jeannette was stuck. "Shut down the engines," DeLong ordered. "Save the coal." He thought they were stuck for a few days. He didn't know they were stuck for forever. The drift had begun. Winter 1879. The Jeannette was no longer a ship. It was a building. The ice had frozen around the hull, locking it in a vise. DeLong tried to free her. They used giant saws to cut the ice. They used gunpowder to blast it. But for every foot they cleared, the ocean froze 2 feet back. They realized the terrifying truth. They were not moving under their own power. They were passengers on a continent of moving ice. And they were drifting the wrong way. They wanted to go north to the pole. The drift was taking them northwest, past the pole, into the empty expanse of the Arctic Ocean. The open polar sea was a joke. As far as the eye could see, there was only white chaos. DeLong established a routine to keep the men sane. Breakfast at 7 o'clock. Inspection at 9 o'clock. Divine service on Sundays. He forced them to exercise on the ice. They played football in -40-degree weather. But you cannot regulate fear. The sun went down in November and didn't come back until January. The long night. Imagine living in a wooden box in total darkness for 70 days. The only light came from the electric arc lamps, which hummed and flickered, casting eerie long shadows on the snow. The men started to look like ghosts. Their skin turned gray. Their eyes sank into their skulls. And then, the illness started. The ship's surgeon, Dr. James Ambler, was a good man. He watched the crew closely. They were complaining of stomach cramps, headaches, sore gums. Scurvy, Ambler thought. But they were taking their lime juice. They were eating the canned tomatoes. It didn't make sense. Ambler tested the food. He looked at the cans of tomatoes. In 1879, canning technology was new. The seams of the cans were soldered with lead. The acid in the tomatoes was eating the solar. The crew wasn't just fighting the cold, they were fighting lead poisoning. They were slowly being intoxicated by their own supplies. It made them irritable, paranoid, weak, and nobody was more paranoid than the captain. The tension between Captain DeLong and Jerome Collins, the journalist, turned toxic. Confined to the small wardroom, they hated each other. DeLong saw Collins as insubordinate. Collins saw DeLong as a tyrant. They argued about everything. About the coal usage, about the navigation, about the Bible. It got so bad that DeLong stopped speaking to him. He communicated only by written notes. Imagine the pettiness. 2 men trapped in the ice at the end of the world passing angry notes across a dinner table. "Mr. Collins, you will cease your whistling." "Captain DeLong, you have no authority over my soul." It was cabin fever in its purest form. The other officers, Melville and Chip, tried to referee, but the wardroom was a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, outside, the real enemy was getting louder. The scariest thing about the pack ice wasn't the cold. It was the noise. The ice was constantly moving, tectonic plates of frozen water, miles wide, smashing into each other. The sound was deafening, like a train crash that never ends, screeching, groaning, thundering. The men would lie in their bunks at night, listening to the hull scream as the ice squeezed it. Pop, bang, creak. Every sound was a threat. Is this the one? Is this the crack that breaks us? They slept with their clothes on. They kept knapsacks packed by the door. For 21 months, they lived in a state of high alert anxiety. Their cortisol levels must have been through the roof. They survived the first winter. Then the first summer, which was just foggy and wet. Then the second winter. By the spring of 1881, they had been trapped for nearly 2 years. They drifted past islands nobody had ever seen before. DeLong named them the Jeannette Islands. It was a discovery, but a pathetic one. "Is this my legacy?" DeLong wrote. "A few barren rocks and a frozen ship?" He was depressed. He felt he had failed Bennett and failed America. But he was about to face a much bigger problem than failure. June 10th, 1881. The ice began to move differently. It wasn't just drifting, it was attacking. A pressure ridge formed off the bow. Great blocks of ice, the size of houses, were being pushed up into the air. They toppled over toward the ship. The Jeannette groaned. The transverse beams in the hold started to bow. DeLong stood on the deck. He felt the vibrations through his boots. "She's complaining," Melville said. "She's dying," DeLong corrected. On June 12th, the final attack began. The ice opened up a lead, a crack of water, alongside the ship. For a second, they thought, freedom. But it was a trap. The ice opened, allowing the ship to settle, and then it slammed shut with millions of tons of force. The sound was like a cannon shot. Crack. The hull timbers snapped. Water rushed into the hold. The ship began to list to the starboard side. The electric lights went out. The darkness returned. DeLong didn't panic. He had been rehearsing this moment for 2 years. "All hands," he shouted. "Abandon ship." It was 4 p.m. The crew moved with practiced discipline. They didn't run. They worked. They lowered the 3 boats onto the ice. The whaleboat, the first cutter, the second cutter. They dragged the sleds out. They unloaded the pemmican, the tents, the sleeping bags, the rifles. They grabbed the ship's logs and the medical chest. Alexei and Onegwin, the Inuit hunters, saved the dogs. About 40 dogs were thrown onto the ice. They ran around confused, barking at the tilting ship. Jerome Collins, the journalist, grabbed his notebooks. He was determined to save the story, even if he couldn't save himself. Within an hour, the Jeannette was empty. The 33 men stood on the ice floe, about 500 yards away. They set up a temporary camp. They watched their home die. June 13th, 1881, 4 a.m. The end came in the early morning. The ice momentarily relaxed its grip. The Jeannette, full of water, heavy with coal and iron, slipped backward. Her bow rose into the air. Her mast made a final arc against the gray sky. She slid beneath the black water. Gurgle, hiss, silence. The ice closed over the spot where she had been. There was nothing left. No trace. Just white snow and black water. The men stood in silence. Some of them cried. The ship had been their womb, their fortress. Now, they were naked. DeLong looked at his map. They were 500 miles from the Siberian coast, 700 miles from the nearest human settlement. They were standing on a piece of ice that was drifting north, away from land. They had 3 heavy boats. They had sleds that weighed 200 pounds each. They had 60 days of food, and they had sick men. DeLong turned to the crew. His voice was steady, the voice of command. "Well, men," he said, "we have no ship, but we have legs. We walked to Siberia." They took stock of their situation. It was a logistical nightmare. The boats were too heavy to drag over the rough ice. The ice was not a skating rink. It was a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, hummocks, and slush. To move 1 mile forward, they would have to travel 3 miles back and forth, ferrying the gear. "We will march at night," DeLong decided. "The sun is up 24 hours now. But at night, the sun is lower, so the glare is less blinding." They were suffering from snow blindness. Their eyes burned like fire. Dr. Ambler handed out dark goggles. They ate a cold meal of pemmican. They harnessed themselves to the sleds. Men became horses. "Heave!" Melville shouted. They pulled. The sled runners dug into the soft snow. They moved 10 yards. then stopped, then 10 yards. It was grueling. And the worst part? DeLong took a GPS reading using a sextant and the sun. After a week of backbreaking marching, he calculated their position. He didn't tell the men. He couldn't. The ice drift was faster than their walking. They had marched south for a week, but the ice had carried them north by 20 miles. They were on a treadmill to hell. June 1881. The ice pack. Captain DeLong carried a secret that was heavier than the sleds. Every day he checked the sun with his sextant. Every day the math told him the same horror story. They were dragging the sled south toward Siberia, sweating and bleeding for every mile. But the ice floe was drifting north toward the pole at a faster speed. They were walking up a down escalator. DeLong looked at the men. They were in rags. Their boots were falling apart. Their feet were black with frostbite and immersion foot, the skin sloughing off from being constantly wet in the saltwater slush. If he told them the truth, that they were actually farther from safety than when they started, they would break. Mutiny? Suicide? Despair? DeLong chose to lie. "Good progress, men," he would say. Another 5 miles south. He shifted the course. He aimed for a jagged black shape on the horizon. An island. It wasn't on any map. It was new land. "We will rest there," DeLong decided. "At least on an island the ground stays still." The island looked close, maybe 10 miles away. It took them 18 days to reach it. The ice between them and the land was a torture garden. It was broken into a chaotic mess of hummocks, hills of ice 20 feet high. They had to build roads. They would chop a path with pickaxes. Then they would drag the heavy boats up the hill, then slide them down the other side, then do it again and again for 18 days. The men were running on fumes. Their diet was pemmican, dried meat and fat, and weak tea. They were burning 6,000 calories a day and eating 2,000. The body starts to eat itself. Muscle wastes away. The mind hallucinates. Jerome Collins, the journalist, was nearly blind from the snow glare. He stumbled along, clutching the side of the boat. Charles Chipp, the executive officer, was dying. Not from the cold, but from the lead poisoning. He was vomiting constantly. He could barely stand. Yet, he commanded his squad with a quiet dignity that awed the men. "Heave," Chipp would whisper. "Heave." July 29th, 1881. They reached the island. They dragged the boats up a steep, rocky beach. For the first time in 2 years, they stood on solid earth, real dirt, real rocks. It felt like a miracle. DeLong planted the flag. He named it Bennett Island, after the man who paid for the trip. It was a desolate, volcanic rock, steep cliffs, glaciers, but it was life. They found birds, thousands of murres nesting in the cliffs. The hunters went out, bang, bang. They feasted, fresh meat. The bird meat revitalized them. The lead poisoning symptoms receded slightly. They rested for a week. They repaired the boats. They looked south. The ice was breaking up. Instead of a solid white sheet, they saw dark veins of water, leads. "The summer melt is here," DeLong said. "We can stop walking. We can start sailing." It was the hope they needed. August 6th, 1881. They pushed off from Bennett Island. They were now a flotilla of 3 boats. One, the first cutter, commanded by Captain DeLong, carrying Dr. Ambler, Jerome Collins, and 11 others. It was the largest boat, about 20 feet long, heavy, slow, but stable. 2, the whaleboat, commanded by Chief Engineer Melville, carrying 9 others. This was the best boat, double-ended, fast, buoyant. Melville had fitted it with a spray hood made of canvas. That hood would save their lives. 3, the second cutter, commanded by Lieutenant Chipp, carrying 7 others. This was the problem. It was a small boat, barely 16 feet. It had low freeboard, the distance from the water to the rim. It was overloaded, and Chip was the sickest man. DeLong worried about the second cutter. "Keep close," he ordered Chip. "Do not lose sight of me." They sailed south. It wasn't easy sailing. They had to dodge icebergs. They had to haul the boats over ice bridges that still blocked the way, but they were moving. They passed the New Siberian Islands. They were aiming for the Lena Delta, a massive river delta on the coast of Siberia. DeLong's map showed a settlement there, Barkin. "If we get to the delta," DeLong told them, "we will find natives, we will find food, we will be saved." He didn't know that his map was wrong. September 11th, 1881. They were in open water now. The ice pack was behind them, the Laptov Sea. It is one of the roughest bodies of water on Earth, shallow, cold, and prone to violent storms. But for a moment, it was calm. The three boats were tied together in a line. DeLong distributed the last of the luxury rations, a little extra tobacco, a piece of chocolate. They were 90 miles from the coast, just 2 days of sailing. They could smell the land. "We made it," Melville thought. "We beat the ice." But the barometer began to fall, not just drop, it plummeted. The sky turned a bruised purple. The wind shifted to the northeast. A gale was coming. Not just a gale, a hurricane. September 12th, 1881. The wind hit them like a hammer. Waves rose to 20 feet. In the open ocean, 20 feet is big. In a 20-foot open boat, 20 feet is a mountain. The boats were tossing like corks. DeLong signaled to untie the lines. "Separate," he yelled. If they stayed tied together, the sinking of one boat would drag the others down. They cut the ropes. Now, each boat was alone in the chaos. DeLong shouted orders to Melville and Chip. "Keep within hail. Head for the delta." But the wind stole his words. Night fell. It was pitch black. The sea was phosphorescent, glowing with angry white foam. The spray froze instantly on the men's coats. They were encased in ice armor. They had to bail water constantly, bucket after bucket. If they stopped bailing for 5 minutes, they would sink. Melville, in the whaleboat, looked back. He was riding the waves better than the others because of his canvas spray hood. He saw DeLong's boat, the first cutter, struggling in the trough of a wave. And way behind, he saw the second cutter, Lieutenant Chip's boat. It was struggling. It was too heavy. It was sitting too low in the water. Melville watched as a massive wave rose up behind Chip. The wave crested. It crashed down on the small boat. Melville waited for it to re-emerge. He waited for the white sail to pop back up. He strained his eyes through the salt spray. Nothing. The second cutter was gone, swallowed whole. Lieutenant Chip and his 7 men didn't even have time to scream. They vanished into the freezing dark of the Laptov Sea. The first 8 casualties of the retreat. Melville wanted to turn back, to look for survivors. But to turn the boat broadside to the waves meant death. He had to keep running before the wind. He wept. "Goodbye, Chip." Now there were 2, DeLong and Melville. But the storm was driving them apart. DeLong's boat was heavier. It lagged behind. Melville's boat was faster. It surged ahead. DeLong fired a flare gun? "No, wet powder," he shouted. But Melville couldn't hear him. The distance grew. 100 yards, 500 yards, a mile. Then, the darkness swallowed Melville too. DeLong was alone. He sat in the stern of the first cutter, steering with frozen hands. He had lost his ship. He had lost one boat. He had lost contact with the other. He had 13 men left with him, including the troublesome Jerome Collins and the loyal Dr. Ambler. They were cold, wet, and terrified. "Hold fast," DeLong whispered. "God is with us." But God seemed very far away that night. The storm raged for another 24 hours. It blew DeLong to the west. It blew Melville to the east. They were heading for the same delta, but they would land hundreds of miles apart, and that distance would make all the difference between life and death. Geography is destiny. The Lena Delta is not a simple river mouth. It is a monster. It is a labyrinth of mud, ice, and channels the size of Scotland. In September 1881, the storm blew the two surviving boats into this maze, but it blew them to opposite ends. Chief Engineer Melville in the whaleboat was blown to the east. The eastern delta was the busy side. It had deep channels. It had fishing villages. It was where the Russian traders went. Captain DeLong in the first cutter was blown to the north. The northern delta was a graveyard. It was a wasteland of shallow mudflats, driftwood, and silence. No villages, no hunters, just emptiness. A difference of 50 miles sealed their fates. One group landed in civilization. The other landed on the moon. September 14th, 1881, the East Delta. Melville's boat rode the storm surge right into one of the main river channels. They met the land gently. They were cold, frozen, and starving, but they were alive. Melville, ever the pragmatist, organized his men. "We must find natives," he said. They sailed up the river. Within days they saw something smoke. 3 Tungus hunters in a canoe. Melville stood up. He waved his arms. The hunters were terrified of these bearded, ice-encrusted giants, but they didn't run. Melville tried to speak Russian. He failed. He tried sign language. Food, sleep. The hunters understood. They took Melville's crew to their village. It wasn't a palace. It was a collection of wooden huts filled with fish and reindeer meat. The sailors ate until they were sick. They slept by a fire. Melville had done it. He had saved his boat. He had saved his crew. But his first thought wasn't celebration. It was the captain. He tried to ask the natives, "Have you seen another boat? A big boat?" The natives shook their heads. The delta was vast. They knew nothing of the north. September 17th, 1881. The North Delta. DeLong's landing was a nightmare. The water was too shallow for the heavy first cutter. About 1.5 miles from the shore, the keel hit the mud. They couldn't sail in. They couldn't row in. They had to walk. Imagine this. 13 men. Starving. Weak from lead poisoning. They have to jump out of the boat into freezing ocean water that is waist deep. The bottom is sticky mud that sucks at their boots. They have to carry everything: the tents, the sleeping bags, the rifles, and the ship's records. DeLong refused to leave the logs. "If we die," he said, "the history of the Jeannette must survive." They made 4 trips back and forth from the boat to the shore, 1.5 miles each way, in freezing water. By the time they hauled the last box onto the beach, they were hypothermic. Their legs were numb blocks of ice. They collapsed on the driftwood. They lit a fire. They looked around. It was a flat, gray horizon of mud and snow. DeLong checked his map, the map made by the famous geographer Petermann. It showed a town called Sagastir nearby. "Cheer up, men," DeLong rasped. "We just have to walk to Sagastir. It's on the map." He didn't know that Petermann had guessed. There was no Sagastir. There was no town. They were walking toward a ghost. The march began. They had 1 sled left. But the ground wasn't snow. It was tundra. Tundra in autumn is a sponge. Wet, mossy, lumpy. Dragging a sled over it is agony. And they had an anchor, H. Eriksson, a Danish sailor, a big, strong man, but the frostbite had taken his feet. His toes were black. Then his feet turned black. Gangrene was setting in. He couldn't walk. They couldn't leave him. "We are Navy men," DeLong said. "We do not leave our own." So they sewed a canvas sling. They took turns carrying him on their backs. Imagine the caloric cost. Starving men carrying a 200-pound man through knee-deep mud. They made 2 miles a day, sometimes 5. They needed to cover 100 miles to reach the nearest likely settlement. At this pace, the math was impossible, but they kept walking, because to stop was to die. September 21st, 1881. They ran out of food. The last can of pemmican was open. DeLong divided it with a spoon. Everyone got a few ounces of grease and meat. They licked the can clean. Now, they were living on tea made from reused leaves and nothing. They chewed on pieces of deerskin leather. They were entering the starvation phase. Then, a miracle. Alexei, the Inuit hunter, saw something. 2 reindeer. He raised his Remington rifle. His hands were shaking from the cold. He fired. 1 deer fell. The men descended on the carcass like wolves. They ate everything. The meat, the heart, the liver. They cracked the bones for marrow. They felt strength return. "We are saved!" Jerome Collins cried. But a deer is not a supermarket. For 14 men, a deer lasts 3 days. After 3 days, the hunger returned. And this time, it was angrier. Dr. James Ambler was the hero of the march. He walked at the back of the line. He checked everyone's feet. He bandaged the sores. He knew Erickson was dying. The smell of the gangrene was overpowering. Ambler pulled DeLong aside. "Captain," Ambler whispered, "his feet are dead. The flesh is rotting off the bone." "We should amputate." DeLong looked at the muddy ground. "Amputate with what, doctor? We have no ether. We have no hospital. The shock would kill him. And even if he survives, how do we carry a man with no feet?" "No. We keep going." It was a command born of despair. Erickson was delirious now. He was muttering in Danish. He was screaming in pain every time they moved him. The morale of the crew was breaking. They looked at Erickson not as a friend, but as the thing that was killing them. October 3rd, 1881. They reached a wide branch of the river. The water was freezing, filled with drifting ice cakes. They had no boat. They had abandoned the first cutter at the landing. They had to build a raft. They found driftwood. They tied it together with rope. But the raft couldn't hold everyone. They had to shuttle across. The wind was howling. On one of the crossings, the raft tipped. They fell into the water. They scrambled out, soaked to the skin. In -20-degree weather, getting wet is a death sentence. They huddled together in a spoon formation to share body heat. But the heat was gone. That night, Erickson died. His heart simply stopped. They stripped him of his clothes. They needed them. They buried him in the river ice. DeLong read the Lord's Prayer. His voice was a whisper. They were sad, yes. But mostly, they were relieved. The anchor was gone. "Now," DeLong said, "we can walk fast." October 9th, 1881. They didn't walk fast. They were too weak. The lead poisoning had damaged their nerves. Their legs wouldn't obey their brains. DeLong realized they were not going to make it. They were stuck in a hut they found, a small fox-trapping hut. It had a roof, but no food. They were trapped by a blizzard. DeLong looked at his men. Some were comatose. Jerome Collins was raving. Only 2 men seemed to have any strength left: Nindemann and Noros. Nindemann was a tough German sailor. Noros was a wiry American. DeLong made the hardest decision of his life. He called them over. "You 2 are the strongest," DeLong said. "You must go ahead. Find a settlement. Find the Russians. Bring help. If you find help, come back for us. If you don't..." DeLong didn't finish the sentence. He gave them a map, the useless map. He gave them 1 rifle and a handful of ammunition. He gave them a meager ration of alcohol. It was a suicide mission to save the group. The goodbye was brief. Nindemann and Noros shook hands with the crew. Dr. Ambler looked at Nindemann. Ambler was strong enough to go. He could have saved himself, but he was the doctor. "I stay with the captain," Ambler said. "Go." Nindemann and Noros stepped out into the blizzard. They walked south. DeLong watched them disappear into the whiteout. He turned back to the men in the hut. He opened his journal. He wrote the date. And then he waited. Now there were 11 men left in the hut, and they had nothing left to eat but their boots. Survival is messy, and the aftermath of survival is even messier. When Melville returned to the United States, he was greeted as a hero. But the Navy is a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies need to assign blame. A court of inquiry was convened in 1882. The question was simple: why did the ship sink? And why did so many men die? The family of Jerome Collins, the journalist, was furious. They blamed Captain DeLong. They claimed DeLong was a tyrant who had mistreated Collins. They claimed that if DeLong hadn't been so stubborn about the open polar sea, they would have turned back sooner. Melville sat in the witness chair. He was the only man who could speak for the captain. He looked at the lawyers. He looked at the press. He told the truth. "The captain was a hard man," Melville said, "but the Arctic is harder. He kept us alive for 2 years in a wooden box. He walked until his feet rotted off. Do not judge him from a warm room in Washington." The court exonerated DeLong. They ruled that the expedition was conducted with seamanship and discipline. But the myth of the open polar sea was put on trial too. The Jeannette proved once and for all that the theory was garbage. There was no warm bath at the top of the world. There was only ice. DeLong had died to kill a lie. 3 years later, 1884, on the southwest coast of Greenland, thousands of miles away from where the Jeannette sank, an Inuit hunter found something on an ice floe: a pair of oilskin trousers, a wooden board, some biscuits. They bore the mark of the USS Jeannette. The world was stunned. How did wreckage from a ship that sank near Russia end up near the Atlantic Ocean? It had traveled right across the North Pole. It proved the transpolar drift. The ice wasn't static. It was a conveyor belt. A young Norwegian explorer named Fridtjof Nansen read the report. He had a radical idea. If the wreckage drifted across the pole, Nansen thought, why can't a ship do the same? Instead of fighting the ice like DeLong, I will ride it. Nansen built a ship called the Fram. It was round-bottomed, designed to pop up when the ice squeezed it. He sailed it into the pack ice, froze it in on purpose, and drifted. He got closer to the pole than anyone before him. Nansen is famous today, but he stood on the shoulders of DeLong. The Jeannette had to die so the Fram could live. It was the final scientific contribution of the expedition. The dead ship pointed the way. Emma DeLong wasn't satisfied with a cross in Siberia. She wanted her husband home. She lobbied the government again. Bring them back. In 1884, a Russian team exhumed the bodies from Monument Hill. They were put in metal caskets. They traveled by sled across Siberia to Moscow, then by train to Germany, then by ship to New York. It was the longest funeral procession in history. When the ship arrived in New York Harbor, the city stopped. Bells tolled, cannons fired. A parade marched down Broadway. It wasn't a celebration of conquest. It was a celebration of endurance. DeLong was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Emma was there. She was a young widow. She lived for another 50 years. She never remarried. She wrote a book, The Voyage of the Jeannette. She edited his journals. She made sure that the world knew that George Washington DeLong didn't fail. He just ran out of time. What is the legacy of the Jeannette? It is not a story of victory. They didn't reach the North Pole. They didn't find new lands, except for a few rocks. but they left a legacy of data. Dr. Ambler's medical notes on lead poisoning and snow blindness are still studied. Jerome Collins's meteorological records helped map the weather patterns of the Arctic. Melville went on to become an admiral. He designed the steam engines for the Great White Fleet. He became the father of the modern steam navy. But the real legacy is the human story. It is the story of Alexei and Aniguin, the Inuit hunters who died far from home, trying to save white men who couldn't hunt. It is the story of Ericsson, who suffered in silence so as not to burden the crew. It is the story of the class of 1881. They were the astronauts of their day. They went into the unknown with bad maps and tin cans. And they showed us what human beings are capable of when the lights go out. If you go to the Lena Delta today, the cross is gone. The wood has rotted away. The stones have scattered. The Arctic is indifferent to our monuments. It erases our footprints as soon as we make them. But the story remains. The story of the 33 men who sailed into the kingdom of ice. We live in an age where we think we have mastered nature. We have heated seats and satellite phones. But the Jeannette reminds us of a humble truth. We are small, and the world is big and cold. Captain DeLong wrote in his final days, "I am still confident in the ultimate success of the mission." He was deluded, he was dying. But that delusion is what makes us human. The refusal to accept the end. The belief that if we just walk one more mile, we will find the river, we will find the rescue. We will find the open polar sea. Sometimes we find it, and sometimes we just find the snow. But the glory is not in the finding. The glory is in the walking.